Hello? Rohin?
Hi everyone, this is Falgun Kompali, co-founder of Upconnect.
Hi, Falco.
Mangalas.
Hi, Shardul. Hi, Falcon.
Hi.
This is Chinnu from Xfinity.
Hi, this is Ramana from Code Tantra.
Hi, Ramana.
Hello.
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 Could anyone hear me? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear anyone for a while.
Yeah, Rohit,
I
we
was
can hear you.
reconnected.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hello, I can see you, Falgun. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me? I think the rest of the panel could hear me earlier, so I'm not sure.
Sure.
Rohit, can you
you're
hear
audible.
us? Can you hear me? We can hear you.
I guess Rohin is having trouble with his.
Yes,
phone.
I'll just text him. Yeah.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Hello, yeah.
Yeah. This
I
is
think
Dr.
I can. Yes, yes. Thank you so much, and apologies for the mix-up.
No, it's okay.
Hello, everyone. Hi.
Hi, Rohin.
I'd been connected
Rohit.
throughout. Hi, how are you? And then I think I switched off my Bluetooth and reconnected again, and the WebEx app refused to recognize it. That's how I got booted out.
Good afternoon, Rohin. Thank you so much. I couldn't meet you the other day, so thanks for doing this for us.
Not at all, Ms. Malik. Really interesting session. I'm looking forward to it, actually. Thanks for inviting me.
Hope people are joining by and by. I don't think we have speakers 1 and 2, and 5. Simply Learn. Prashant is going to join soon.
Got it. I also saw the email that Sanjay Nair is not joining, right? So,
That's right. So I
okay,
just wanted to tell you also that. So he's dropped out. So we'll start once few more people join. So maybe 2-3 minutes more. And Rohin, we leave it up to you now because this
yeah,
is
will you give me a
second
cue
session.
on when to start? I'll start with the introductory message and then I'll hand it over to Mr. Shroff for his remarks. And then I think
Yeah.
we'll come back to the session itself and I'll explain along the way how the session is structured.
Okay. And timing is flexible now. It's 2:30 to 4:30, but if you want to end sooner also, it's fine. Yeah.
All right.
Thanks.
The last section is about Q&A. So I think it's a function of, the number of questions we receive and how
Yeah, we
interesting
lost
those are.
We lost you for a few seconds. You said the last, and then after
Yeah,
that.
so I was saying that the last section is anyway Q&A. So depending on the kind of questions and the number of questions we get, I suppose we can kind of be flexible if you want to end it earlier.
Absolutely. Some questions from the previous session, I think. Who's this? Hello, could CCI re-invite me as a
That was me. That was me.
Okay.
Because I got booted.
Right.
Just to all the panelists, once again, because some of us had met on a call a couple of days ago, but I'll just repeat, we're not going into this. So the call that we took was that we're not going into this with any predetermined set of topics.
Okay, I lost you, Rohin. I don't know if other people can hear you.
Oh, really? Okay.
We can hear you. We
Okay.
can hear you.
Yeah, so I'll repeat. So we decided that we're not going to go into this topic with any preconceived list of things that we needed to
Now
discuss.
I lost you.
You still can't hear me? Everyone else, or is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
We
Who's
can hear you. We can hear you. All
Yeah.
of us.
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right. I feel like I'm being gaslit on my Bluetooth audio. So we will not have, so we'll evolve the topics organically after the initial introductions and Mr. Shroff's remarks. We'll go one by one, and I will give each of you the time to introduce yourself and to explain how you see this landscape, how you place yourself or your organizations within it. And if there are problems or opportunities, how do you want to solve them? So through that process, we go through everyone and we assimilate a set of things that we are all interested in. And I think we'll use those to discuss in the next session. So we start with a clean slate on M&A, and then we'll evolve the topics based on what each of us brings up.
And how long do we take each of us, Rohin?
Yeah,
3
so
minutes?
yeah, there are 11 of us. To just keep that section short, I thought about 4 minutes per. Of course, it's flexible.
Yeah.
I mean, it could
Should
push
be
to
okay. I
about
think
5.
some of them are
With
not going to
people who
make
have dropped off, you'll have more time per person.
Yeah, so it's Mr. Shroff, it's flexible. So if someone takes 5 minutes, it's fine. If someone wraps it up in 3 minutes, it's fine. But broadly, I suppose 5 minutes per person. And I wonder if it's possible for me to just share. So I just made like a brief slide, so I'll just ask everyone to say like the same 5 things. I mean, and this is for the panelists. Please introduce yourself. How does your organization fit into India's M&A landscape? I mean, is it as an acquirer, as an investor, as an acquiree, as an advocate, etc.? That's question 2. Question 3 is that at a very 30,000 feet level, what are the problems that you see in the current M&A landscape? I mean, if you don't see any problems, that's fine. Question 4 is, what are the opportunities in the M&A landscape? And the last one is, do you feel that we need interventions or solutions from regulators? And if so, what are those solutions? So that way, I think the objective is everyone is able to say, like, what they see of this space, of the M&A space, of the problems and opportunities, and what is it that they want as an intervention, if at all. And then we'll organically derive from the responses that we get, which will feed into the discussion in the next section.
Sounds great.
Rohin, I think we can start now.
Can start? All right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So welcome to our session 2 on mergers and acquisitions. This session, as you know, will be moderated by Mr. Rohin Dharma Kumar, Chief Executive Officer, the KEN. Rohin, over to you.
Thank you, Ms. Ghosh, and welcome everyone after the lunch session. Post-lunch sessions are always harder on all of us. I hope we can all, as the moderator and as the panelists, make it more interesting for you. First off, I would like to kind of re-welcome all of you back again and thank the CCI, the secretary, the chairperson, and all the staff, who've helped us organize this. I've always been amazed by how these things have changed so much in recent years, where we're discussing many of these issues in the open, in a collaborative manner. This continues to be one of those events. I was there throughout for the earlier session pre-lunch, and it was really interesting. I took a bunch of notes from those, which I hope some of which will come into our discussion as well. We're discussing mergers and acquisitions in this session. And it's very interesting that we should be discussing this, because normally you don't discuss something like this, because it remains something very abstract. Why we're discussing mergers and acquisitions. I think my takeaway from all of the conversations in the morning, including from all of the people at the CCI, is that the objective of this entire session today is to preserve and enhance competition. Now, it's a very simple line, but I mean, it's incredibly tough and it's incredibly complex. There's lots of pulls and pressures. Sometimes there are so many markets we've seen as consumers or as players where increasing competition makes things better. Sometimes decreasing competition makes things better. So I don't think there is any one line on what is the appropriate line for optimal competition, and especially in the context of mergers and acquisitions. Many participants in the session earlier have talked about that sometimes regulators ought to stay away and let markets and capital find a way, and that's absolutely true. But it's also true that sometimes regulators do need to get involved when it comes to mergers and acquisitions and guide the outcome in such a manner that it's closer to optimal for all the parties involved. So my point is that the importance of preserving and enhancing competition is much harder than it looks, especially for regulators. The dualities are just incredible. All of us love competition as a consumer, but not so much as entrepreneurs, if you're really honest about it. Everyone loves to compete. Everyone hates being competed against. Everyone wants easier rules to get in, but everyone wants tighter rules to keep others out. The reason I bring up these dualities is just to prove the fact that no one is unbiased. Everyone has agendas, and that's good. I'll quote Mr. Ashok Kumar Gupta, the Honorable Chairperson of the CCI, who said this in the morning. He said, acquisitions are good. The profile of Indian acquirers is changing. Startups are acquiring more startups using funding, as a result of which they're becoming bigger and they can raise more funding. Hence, the amount of funding in India is increasing. In systems thinking, you would call this somewhat of a positive feedback loop. Something that one entity does impacts another entity, which does something, and it creates a virtuous loop that increases and makes everything better. There's also the possibility of a negative loop as acquisitions increase. And by the way, this also was hinted at upon by Mr. Gupta, right? As acquisitions increase, the potential for anti-competitive behavior also increases. He talked about how digital business models don't trigger earlier historical norms of when to observe, for example, asset turnover thresholds, right? Which means that M&As that potentially should have been caught and analyzed escape the river. And he talked about how the new competition bill proposes newer methods to ensure that digital acquisitions are reported. But at the end of the day, the counter to this is that if there is too much of that, then it starts what we call a negative feedback loop. And he said that as well, right? We need to strike a balance between excessive filings versus not allowing deals to escape. And that really is, it's an impossible task. There is no one point where you can draw the line and say, this is the exact place where regulations ought to be. This is where competition is maximized. But it's a worthy problem for all of us to discuss and solve. And it's a constantly moving line. Where that line is today may not be where it will be next year. And it certainly wasn't where it was the last year. As a journalist, and I am a journalist, this is something that we take pains to explain every day. Bias. It's important to understand, especially in this session, that we don't operate in a neutral, agenda-less world where things happen for no particular reason. Instead, we are all part of complex systems linked together by agendas, by motivations, by ambitions, by goals, etc. Those are not bad words, those are great. That's what enables disruption. That's what enables competition. So I want to make sure that we talk about many of these concepts in today's session. For instance, some of the agendas or motivations or objectives, if I were to look at it from CCI's point of view, many people talked about it will help guide their ex-ante efforts. I mean, it's a legal term. What it essentially means is occasionally and many times regulators will take steps before something happens. Right? No one knows for sure, but they have to do it sometimes, which means that sometimes they get it wrong, sometimes they get it right. They talked about understanding the key drivers and implications. He talked about understanding motivations. Now, in general, people, especially Asians and especially Indians, are uncomfortable talking about motivations because we feel that there's something very wrong about motivation. Of course not. All of us have motivations, especially in economics. Nandan Elekan was the keynote speaker, a person I admire a lot, talked about his objectives and motivations. He talked about his desire to ensure a level playing field, about open access, about common infrastructure. Now you'll notice his motivations, as he stated them today, were very different from, let's say, someone else's. And there's all the other players that are there. What is the motivation of a foreign acquirer? What is the motivation of an Indian acquirer? We talk about big tech, but I don't think big tech any longer makes sense because unless you look at it as foreign big tech and domestic big tech, they have different objectives, they have different agendas, they have different motivations. What is the motivation of a VC firm in this space? Or an operator PE firm, which doesn't just invest, but also acquires businesses to build them up to scale and run it and then sell it. What's the objective of a young startup? Is it to sell out? Is it to raise money in the hope that somebody might buy them? What's the objective of a late stage startup? What are the objective of law firms, of consumers, of employees and students? All of these are impacted. If you're in college and if you're passing out, it absolutely impacts you what kind of an M&A landscape will exist, which depends on which company you join, how many jobs are there. The reason I bring all of these up is to once again reiterate the fact that we cannot pretend that agendas and motivations don't matter. Instead, we need to lean into it. If we think of free markets or competition as a multi-sided equation or function, then in order to solve for them, we need to understand all or as many of the variables involved. Only then can we hope to optimize for solutions that are closest to being optimal. I don't say optimum because I personally don't think it's possible. It's impossible. No one can design an optimum solution, especially in this space. Thus, only by seeing and acknowledging all our biases and motivations can we hope to become, ironically, somewhat unbiased. And that's how we're going to approach today's format. The objective of today's format, and I'll explain that briefly, is to uncover as many problems, opportunities, solutions, and objectives from the unique lens that each of our panelists brings. It is not to force any predetermined agendas or topics on anyone, but instead see the world through their eyes and then hopefully try to have a discussion around that, a collaborative discussion, if I may. Thus, we'll break this into 3 parts. Part 1 is all about the panel and the panelists. We'll give each panelist approximately 4 to 5 minutes to introduce themselves and to explain in their own words what they see as either or both the problems and the opportunities around M&A. I'll put up a small slide when we get to that section, which will just have 4 or 5 questions, and everyone is free to essentially give the responses to that. Once we're done with that in part 1, we will get on to part 2, which is going to be a discussion on some of the most pertinent issues that came up from part 1. So that way we get to actually debate the points that came up. And then part 3 is going to be an interactive Q&A where first panelists can ask questions to their fellow panelists if they want to, or we'll also invite the audience to send in questions and ask panelists. The role of the moderator, that is me, will be to just moderate and to steer the conversation in a way that we're debating solutions instead of just stating problems. Because at the end of the day, I think it's important that we talk about some of the proposed solutions and argue them between ourselves. I hope this works out. It's something that we're going to try out collectively together, including with the audience. And I'm looking forward to it. But for now, I'm going to hand it over to the opening remarks to Mr. Shardul Shroff, the Executive Chairman of Shardul Amarchand Mangalas, which is one of India's best-known law firms.
Thank you, Rohin, and thanks to all of you for giving me this opportunity to come and speak. I must compliment the CCI for holding such a workshop and for selecting such a vibrant scheme for this workshop, the startup ecosystem. It is heartening to see CCI as a young regulator, just 10 years old, work tirelessly to impress upon stakeholders the importance of innovation and competition and organize this fruitful session for making these values. My address today deals with the changing landscape of mergers and acquisitions in the startup space. These are good times for deal making in India, and M&A has reached 3-year highs after deals worth $90.4 billion were struck in the first 9 months of 2021. We have 44 unicorns, and the VCs and private equity have invested up to 5.5 lakh crores in the economy, as has been explained by the finance minister in a budgetary speech. Therefore, there is a budgetary angle also in looking at the structure of how M&A has to happen and continue to happen in the field of startups. There are 6 major issues which are arising or which are likely to arise in the context of mergers and acquisitions or combinations as they are known. The 2 aspects of the VC looking towards investing in a stable environment with a certain legal regime and a possibility of a high return and a quick exit. From the perspective of the company or the startup, the perspective is to grow larger, either by provision of capital or by acquisition of talent or by acquisition of something which is incidental to a strategic investor. And there are many causes and many reasons why M&A is welcome in the startup space. But 3 of 6 issues, as I mentioned, are critically likely to arise in the short run and which therefore need the input of the startups and some amount of feedback to the regulators so that the regime does not become more difficult and more hard for the investors to participate in the startup space in India. I'll just highlight these 6 issues and then if necessary, we can talk about them. These issues are the question of alternate jurisdiction thresholds. The government has contemplated that it can allow CCI an additional power to determine additional parameters or grounds at the instance of the central government, and these can be applied in examining a merger and acquisition. Now, the reason why this is a problematic area is that it introduces newer and greater restraints or restrictions or parameters which are today not there and which may therefore slow down the process of new acquisitions or venture capital introduction into a startup. Another sort of area which is being looked at globally is this concept of killer acquisitions, where what is meant by a killer acquisition? This is for the purpose of checking whether there are any enforcement gaps. A killer acquisition, as characterized by scholars, is a case where the acquiring firm's strategy is to preemptively scupper potential innovation by the target by acquiring it when it is still nascent. So you kill the idea, and that's not good for competition. That is not good for consumer welfare either. So this proposed or supposed enforcement gap occurs as targets generally have modest assets and turnover, and therefore most such transactions do not trip any of the jurisdictional thresholds requiring a CCI notification. The current status of India's competition policy and competition law is recognized today as a clear competition enforcement policy, which is based on defined parameters and has little scope of speculation. This is high praise for India, and it has been a function of time with CCI's jurisprudence having developed on key issues over the past decade. Therefore, now we are a country which can finally reap the benefits of CCI's 10 years of functioning. And therefore, I have my reservations on tinkering with the existing state of affairs, especially when the suggested quick fixes will increase uncertainty and not reduce ambiguities in respect of issues that prevail now. What are the fundamental aspects of a startup's cycle to understand understand how the startup regime and the P and the VC regime will react. In a startup, the basic theme is to scale up its business, and scaling up of the business requires capital and in some sense expertise of investors. And in today's circumstances, it is acquisition of talent, because talent is scarce, and the great resignation of last year and currently continuing is impacting almost every service sector. What is the consideration that it offers to the private equity and VCs? It ensures returns on capital invested, high returns, and importantly, an easy exit. These are the two principles which attract investment. Now, if we bring in a more unfavorable regime for both startups and investors, this will have an impact of how the world relooks at India's competition regime. A proposition on fixing additional parameters in combination with the central government was rejected by the Competition Law Review Committee for its apparent practical and operational challenges, such as accounting for fluctuation in share prices and determining deal value in complicated cases of earnouts and performance-based deferred payment provisions, to name a few. As an alternative, the Competition Amendment Bill of 2020 has proposed a residuary power to CCI to review any transaction that is likely to cause appreciable adverse effect on competition, based on any relevant thresholds identified by the central government in consultation with CCI. My biggest concern with this approach is that of uncertainty. Uncertainty for investors who may be willing to bet on Indian startups. The investors would remain unsure of the transaction timelines, if a pre-merger approval is required or not, the legal costs following it, and in devising a profitably exit strategy. In fact, it is also for this reason that any such quick fix in the Indian context is counterintuitive. Without interested investors, cash-strapped startups and new innovators would be hesitant in bringing anything to the market, thereby limiting innovation in India. More importantly, these would add to the burden of the CCI in terms of reviewing more transactions, which may not, in the current scenario of a budgetary deficit, have any elements of the AAC. In concluding this point, I must add that the existing Competition Act has sufficient safeguards against this supposed enforcement gap in the form of CCI's powers to investigate dominant enterprises under Section 4. More importantly, Section 19, subsection 4, bracket M of the Competition Act empowers the CCI to consider any factor in determining if an entity is dominant, and therefore CCI's powers are not limited by any threshold. Accordingly, a calibrated ex post facto antitrust investigation, as opposed to an ex ante assessment of all M&A activity, would save the risk of false positives and would still be able to fill the gap of enforcement. Secondly, the expiry of the de minimis exemption. This is something which would concern all of you. Following the scene that I have covered with reference to the additional parameters contemplated for extra powers to the CCI, I would also like to talk of the exemption which is in existence, probably not for a long time because it is intended to be withdrawn by March. But this exemption has been of immense help to both the stakeholders and the CCI. The DME, or the de minimis exemption, in its current form has been a catalyst to drawing investors into India as a favorable investment destination in implementation. And in implementation, it has substantially demonstrated that the government means business with its ease of doing business initiative. Especially with reference to startups, the exemption has enabled them to easily secure funding through multiple investors. For investors, it has saved them from legal costs associated with making a CCI filing and has expedited transaction timelines. Last year, about 90 combinations were considered and approved by the CCI, and these have been done in a record time of almost 17 days, which in a pandemic is extremely welcome and a great sign of the maturity of CCI as a regulator. But if we remove this exemption, the likelihood of an adverse effect on competition, on the entry of investors, and the timelines being extended is a serious disability which is likely to happen. And therefore, stakeholders must request for a sense of stability and continuity with reference to the merger control regime, and doing away with the exemption would postpone the ease of obtaining the investments and proceeding to make the acquisitions. The third big issue is in relation to control. And this is a very vexed question which has arisen in many statutes, including the Takeover Code and more particularly the Competition Act. And there are different approaches to the meaning of control in both these statutes or both these regulations. Recently, in the Supreme Court of India's case of SR Steel Limited, where the ArcelorMittal had acquired this control, the court, and in particular Justice Nariman, has used the Subcam case logic as the guiding principle of control in relation to acquisitions. Since it's a Supreme Court judgment, it would have a binding effect on all high courts and regulators in India. Way back in the 1980s, when the case of Larsen and Toubro was concerned, and the Bob Fiscal had transferred its shares to the Reliance Group, Justice Kotwal in the Mumbai High Court had held that addition of 3 directors in a board of 12 is not change of control, because ultimately they are a minority in the context of 7 majority directors, and that does not constitute a change of control. But this is still a vexed question, and many more, and many repeated issues keep arising, because the question of what constitutes control is pivotal in determination of the notification obligations of transaction parties, as well as a substantive analysis of the transaction. The Competition Act does not provide any guidance regarding the set of rights that constitute control. To this extent, CCI must be commended for setting out its interpretation of this term, basing its interpretation on international jurisprudence and crystallizing it through decisional practice. The CCI.
I'm sorry. I apologize for cutting in, but could I request you to possibly hurry up a bit, because we have 3 other sections remaining after this.
Yeah, so what I will do is I'll just highlight the 6. I will not go into more details. I have a prepared text, but let me just highlight the 6 issues that are important for M&A practice in startups. So the control question is very critical, and control in the context of take data centers or big data. How do you evaluate the big data? What are the norms on the basis of which you decide the jurisdictional threshold is an extremely vexed question across the globe, because there are no known parameters of aggregation of data, and the valuation of such an aggregate or trove of data. So that is one issue which requires careful consideration in the context of startups. The computation of asset value and turnover in a virtual world is also a critical issue for PE funds, venture capitalists, and other financial vehicles when they make the investments in a startup. So if the valuation principles are going to be relooked at, or the control principles are going to be relooked at, as I mentioned earlier, the stable regime in relation to competition may go into a tailspin, and it might affect M&A in startups. The CCI's approach vis-a-vis other regulatory authorities is also critical. And what do I mean by that? We have a data protection bill which has been proposed by the Parliamentary Standing Committee and has been placed before the Parliament. That bill contemplates how the data regulator will look at questions of privacy and issues in relation to what constitutes non-private data and private data or sensitive private data are all matters under consideration in that law. Now, in relation to the concerns of the startup data, this necessitates a mandatory discussion process between the CCI and the data protector, because otherwise there will be conflicts of jurisdiction, and this may result in more litigation and more problems in relation to startups. And this is therefore a factor I thought it is important to bring to your notice so that you can consider this in the course of your debate in relation to what should be the continued regime of M&A in India. Thank you so much, Rohan. And thanks all of you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shroff, for your detailed, I think, framing of all the various issues. And I draw a special note to, I think, the point that you mentioned about stability and, like, being careful about not tinkering too much, because, like, that's a danger in a sense. So it's a very valid fear, and I think it'll definitely be something that we'll discuss. With that, I'd like to switch to the second part of our, which is essentially segment 1, which is the introductions. I'm going to try and put up a slide so that everyone can talk about the same things. Please give me a minute. Oh, it looks like I cannot do that. All right, some permission issues. I apologize. I'm going to introduce, call upon you one by one. And before we get into this section about self-introduction, there are two things I'd made a note of there. I think most of you would have heard it. There is a very famous saying called, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." In the context of regulations, especially, it's very important. And I think that's partly what Mr. Shroff was also hinting at, that I think before we decide to intervene, we need to be careful what we are trying to intervene for. That's the first thing to keep in mind. And the other one, which is also very interesting, is this dialogue from a Hindi movie, which is called "Aap Party Ho Ya Broker." Are you the interested party or are you the broker? I bring this up again to point out that all of us approach mergers and acquisitions from our own lenses. It's important to, like, let the other party know what our motivation and agenda is. So when each of you are, like, making your introductions, please remember, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And aap party ho ya broker. I'm going to call upon Vijay Shekhar Sharma, the founder and CEO of Paytm, to be the first of the order I'm going by is the order that was decided upon by CCI. And Vijay, here's what I would want you to do over 4 or 5 minutes. Please introduce yourself. Please tell us how your organization fits into India's M&A landscape as an acquirer, as an investor, as an advocate, right? And 3, what are the problems that you see with the current M&A landscape? or any opportunities? And lastly, if you feel that we need interventions from regulators, what are they?
Thank you, Rohin, and thank you, CCI, for inviting us here. I'm founder CEO of Paytm, so my related association with this will be as an acquirer or an investor. Mostly in those events, we are the role playing. The learning that I've had by various interactions on M&A and related matters of CCI is that I fundamentally believe that this is a critical junction because, like Rohin said, it's not just big tech of the world, it is also big organizations of India. Now the consolidation impact of a single platform is dramatically higher. The one single company's role, which used to be finite in the physical world because it was tough to build conglomeratic scaling structures because it was physical in nature, is now dramatically changing because of digital in nature. So companies which are technology led can get and impact multiple spheres of a common citizen's life, making it even more important at a different scale than previously it has been envisaged. In my opinion, the regulator's strengths are the ability to understand the matter and ability to lead the discussion where there is a situation that has come. For example, in case of CCI, the biggest limiting factor I personally foresee is that it is not just a young regulator, but it is now becoming a critical regulator with much less resources available to themselves. For example, like if a company in domestic to domestic or international cross domestic is happening, their learning of that whether what matters inside this is dramatically limited and restricted because of the wide variety of impact every M&A brings on common citizens' life. It is not just revenue consolidation or a user consolidation or it could totally be a blocker of some competition deal. It could totally be a data consolidation deal. So the target is owning certain amount of data, certain amount of assets, certain amount of IP, certain amount of inherent commercial value, which is not defined as a tangible commercial value, typically as a KPI, normally a competition commission or a competition board sees. Which brings to the question of that, how do they know it? It's a little tricky for them to understand because they are not supposed to know everything about every business by definition. The expertise budgets, I'm not sure whether they would have it on their side. That can they recruit a consultant who can tell them that what is inside it? And can they ask somebody to do a little bit of research around the world that, can you tell me what is happening on this topic around the world or on this particular M&A, that what has happened and what are the opinions? So I begin by saying that the foremost thing as a player of, like I said, of an interest, because we are going to target some M&As and we are going to invest in certain companies. The approach I seek and the input I seek from CCI and the control I seek from CCI is that CCI has a comprehensive understanding of how one party's control over other party or this investment over other party influences competition landscape in the country. I share this interesting example that all of you may be aware of, and this is a very old, maybe very early days of CCI. In those days, 2016 it happened. And this is called WhatsApp acquired by Meta, in those days Facebook. It was not revenue company. It was just some free service company. It has nothing to drive in India. But today, the most critical data of this country resides on WhatsApp platform, not on telecom operator platform. If a telecom operator is licensed for giving data to law enforcement agencies and certain amount of control and systems of consolidation, market share, and so on, India's messaging is controlled by one single company, and it's like as an order of magnitude bigger. Now think about when the M&A happened, they did not even bother about this M&A should be approved in India or not. So my point on the table is that we today are overly underestimating. So the word is that you're overly underestimating the impact of a deal that would be on common citizen of this country. And let me say this NVIDIA ARM deal, which we would be just saying, wow, so far away, how can it be impacting us and so on. Again, the same way, if the chip supply to this country is being blocked, if the ability of our country to design chips will block, if the semiconductor industry is going to not allow us to put some things, we're done. So these are the global impacts that happen in India. while you look at the domestic to domestic innovations, again, the same thing is happening. Like Rohan said very well, that India is an open market. In so many sectors, we have 100% FDI. So the covered up 100% ownership that could be here, is dramatically limited. I mean, can we say that a company A that is majority owned foreigner, single foreigner, multiple foreigner, is an Indian company or not? And then when we look at those parameters, does this apply or not? My concern remain the CCI's ability to deep dive on a matter related to technology-led M&A will be limited till the time period they have access to many experts, consultants, advisors who can advise them. Typically, they would reach out to lawyers as an advisors, but my concern is that lawyers also do not know these businesses. So they can they go to business consultants? Can they go to industry advisors? I may suggest that to address the need of technology-led M&As, typically a committee of advisors onboarded and available, or data that is analyzed and given input will be an extremely important factor in going forward. Second thing, CCI need to also be this brings an understanding of, let's say we solve this problem, that there is an understanding of business model that they have, there is an understanding of what it impacts on India or not, what we have. And then comes the second factor, the clout of the target, or clout of the company that is attempting to invest or acquire. Now, these things, we are seeing that tons of arbitrations go around, tons of, I mean, thanks to the democratic structure that we have created in India, there will always be restrictions that what can CCI do level of restrictions. And when you talk about large penalties and limitations, etc., that CCI could force, I would rather go with another expectation here that CCI could be given even far more enormous powers than today. For example, like SEBI can restrict you from accessing the market. Can CCI stop you from accessing another M&A? Oh, nobody fears that. Oh, SEBI could stop me to do another investment or playing the market. So now it is a very different mathematics, right? So are you a market manipulator? Are you an M&A manipulator? If I could discover, I would stop I would create a cold period for 12 months, X number of quarters for your applications or requests, so that the companies are serious about what a CCI's control could mean. And my intention in this is to give CCI powers or abilities of size that typically SEBI as a market control or influence has, or regulator like the central bank obviously has even more powers related to currency and economy. I would not go because this is 3-4 minutes. I do not know. There was no timer. But macro, I want to tell you is that I'm seeking a wiser, smarter CCI. It does not mean it is not, but I'm trying to say which has an oversight of impact that it can see and foresee what could matter to this country. For example, like today, Android has a dominance like everyone understands, and in desktop computers, Microsoft has the dominance, and in computer chips, actually Intel has a dominance. Let me not say that it is just an example. Now, if they do something to this country, can CCI solve or be in the matter that welcome to this country's investment? Would you rather confirm that if you have more than 75% clear majority obligation of market share? Now, the interesting thing is always that people define how the market share definition is. This is the biggest problem that CCI always goes for. Again, they need advisors to define that it is not e-commerce market share, it is a retail market share. And how do I look at it? In other words, I'm just trying to put up back to this topic that hopefully CCI becomes far more stronger in terms of actions it can take and far more insightful for action it has to take. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. And thank you for pointing out that I did not set a timer, so I'm going to correct that. So from the next participant onwards, I'll set up a 4-minute timer, and approximately at the 3.5-minute mark, I'll just tell the participant as well. I've made notes from what you said, Vijay. Thanks a bunch. The next one would be Abhiraj Singhbal, the co-founder of Urban Company. Abhiraj, hi. The slide is now up. Thanks to Ms. Malik. So please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you, Rohin, and thank you very much to the CCI team for having me on this panel. My name is Abhiraj. I'm the founder and CEO of Urban Company. We are a platform that offers home services to customers in 5 countries. How do we see ourselves fitting into the Indian M&A landscape? We haven't done much M&A till date. We have done one acquisition a long time back, and that was also for talent, so it was an acqui-hire. But I would say we are a potential acquirer. We're always on the lookout for interesting companies that can add capabilities or help us enter new markets. I'll go to the 4th question first, which is the opportunities. I think from our company's lens, we think about opportunities largely in 3 buckets. The first and most important is market entry. We are entering both new cities in India as well as international geographies. And whenever we see a good company, even if it's smaller, and a good team that can accelerate our market entry, that's, I would say, the type of M&A that we get very excited by. We haven't done any so far, but we're definitely on the lookout. The other would be organizations that can add new capabilities, particularly technology-related capabilities to our repertoire. And that's something that we also scout for. And finally, companies that can help us move into adjacent businesses, be it for us, we are a services marketplace, so be it in the products category or other related categories. I don't see too many problems, to be honest, with the current M&A landscape. At the highest level, I think we have a vibrant M&A ecosystem in India. As far as the regulator is concerned, I think CCI, by and large, has been playing both a proactive and at the same time a role where it knows where to enter and where to steer clear from. And I think it's a very mature regulator for the fact that it's only 10 to 15 years old. I see their role as largely 2. One is to ensure that there's level playing field, and the other is to ensure that there's fair competition. And I think that's the lens to use for any M&A that's happening. And if those 2 criteria are going to be in some shape and form distorted as a result of that M&A activity, then I think it's the role of the regulator to step in. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhiraj. You're well within time. Next, I'd like to call upon Akshant Goel, the Chief Financial Officer at Zomato. Akshant, I hope I got your pronunciation right.
Yeah, Rohin, that's fine. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, CCI, for having me on this panel here. So again, thanks for the slide, Rohin, very helpful. So I'll just go question by question here. So I'm Akshant Goel. I'm the Chief Financial Officer at Zomato. Been with the company for the last 5 years. In terms of how we fit into India's M&A landscape, I think, over time, that has evolved. And, for a large part of our journey in the last 5 years, I think raising capital, which is perhaps, so I think to my mind, while we are saying M&A here, but raising funds or, doing minority investments, I would like to believe is also in the scope here because CCI does play a role in those transactions as well. So historically, I think when we raised capital, a lot of our financial investors have had to take CCI approval to invest. So I think as an investee, we fit into the framework. And, now and going forward, I would imagine that we'll be an acquirer and an investor, as we look to expand our business and some of the objectives that Abhiraj mentioned in terms of opportunities also apply to us. In terms of current problems with the current M&A landscape, I don't see much there. I think it's most regulators in India, in our experience, and we've dealt with SEBI during our IPO, CCI also on and off, I think are very constructive and progressive. So I don't really have any feedback or comments to make here. In terms of opportunities, I think M&A is is a meaningful driver of growth of the startup ecosystem. I think I would imagine more than perhaps the traditional industry. And that's because every startup in India is not built to IPO, right? And there are successful businesses and startups which are built where exit route is usually a acquisition by a larger business or entity, and hence I think M&A is more significant for the growth of this ecosystem than it is for the traditional business. And I think the role of regulators here, including CCI, has to be, and as you Rohin rightly mentioned, it's not an easy answer. There's a balance here. But I would imagine, we should link it to the scale of the businesses and Zomato and Paytm and some of the companies that are large, but for small startups, I would imagine it has to be a light touch approach, right? Which doesn't come in the way of consummating these transactions, because speed is very important in startups, right? I mean, while in traditional M&As you can wait for a few months, it doesn't really change anything. In a startup ecosystem, especially with early stage startups, businesses evolve and become extinct in few months, right? So I think that is important to keep in mind, when we look at interventions here, because I think both the absolute timeline as well as the uncertainty of time makes some of these decisions, very difficult. So, I think to the last question, we've had few interactions with CCI, and I want to thank the Commission for being very constructive, progressive, always with our discussions. And I think the biggest one to my mind in terms of looking to solve is I think driving more certainty around timelines. Because I think the law is at some places ambiguous, right? It's not a very detailed law, and a lot of the decisions about whether this is actually something which CCI needs to look at or not is based on judgment and past decisions. And in that context, if there is more certainty of how fast CCI will turn around things, then people will sort of take that call of going to the regulator all the time rather than actually trying to find ways to avoid going to the regulator, right? Because there is no certainty of time. So yeah, so that is one, and I guess there's other small issues. Maybe we can pick those up during the discussion, Rohin. But yeah, largely that's what I'd like to say right now.
Thank you, Akshan. I'd like to call upon Falgun Kompally, the co-founder of Upgrad, for the next introduction.
Hi, thanks Rohan, and thanks CCI for having me and Upgrad on this panel. As Rohan mentioned, my name is Falgun Kompally and I'm one of the co-founders of Upgrad. And very briefly, talking about Upgrad, we're one of the largest online higher education platforms, and our vision is to be the go-to or preferred lifelong learning partner for folks globally, not just in India. And when we think of that as our vision, and that's where I think when we think of M&A, there are two key opportunities that we at Upgrad look at. The first is when you think of higher education, it's a very broad spectrum, right? You can be 18 years old or you can even be 80 years old and you want to learn. So there are various consumer groups, there are various audience, and their needs are very different. This could be different stakeholders, these could be people of different ages, could be universities, could be corporates, etc. We as Upgrad can only in-house build that much, and covering the whole spectrum will take time. So we see M&A as a great opportunity to accelerate this journey in order to make sure that we can be lifelong learning partners for the folks. The second is the opportunity to be global. I think, again, we take a lot of pride in the kind of competencies around learning distribution that we've built. And that is something that we want people globally to have access to. And one of the things we keep saying about the education sector is that education is $1 trillion cottage industry. It's probably one of the largest segments of the GDP spend, but it has many companies which are extremely small and no global giants. And I think there's a reason for that, because people have very strong local preferences when it comes to education. I'll just share a funny anecdote. For those of you who know an advertising institute called MICA in India, and we launched a digital marketing program with them, which was very famous. A lot of people wanted to do digital marketing. We went ahead and launched the same digital marketing program with Oxford, and we said, let's bring international opportunities also. And when I launched it personally, I felt that, look, Oxford is going to do so much better because it's an international brand, right? To our surprise, Mica was still doing significantly better as a product. And then out of curiosity, I called 50 of these consumers and said, okay, when you look at both these products, how are you choosing Mica versus Oxford? And I remember a funny thing that somebody said. They said that, look, boss, if I do it from Mica, people will believe I did it. If I say I did it from Oxford, even my mother is not going to believe that I did a course at Oxford, right? So I think there is this concept of believability, concept of connect, concept of community that is very important in the area of education. And even in the US, we see that even when universities offer online, they get about 70-80% of their enrollments within a 200-mile radius. So education, while we are working very hard to use tech to build global platforms and leverage that to scale, we need to work with the reality that there are very strong local preferences. And that's where when we as Upgrad expand internationally, we are looking at acquisition opportunities to help us on that journey. So that's where we are very excited about. And to answer the question on what our role would be an investor/acquirer role, where we are very excited to work with entrepreneurs across the spectrum, across the globe, to give them access to the competencies that we have built at Upgrad over the last 7 years, which is in world-class online delivery, in distribution and in capital, and use their capabilities and competencies to really accelerate the vision of providing quality access to higher education across the world. So that's where we have done acquisitions in India, a few of them, but also internationally in Australia, Southeast Asia, Africa, etc. So that's what is exciting for us, and when we think of M&A and how we can accelerate this journey.
Falgun, we're close to 4-minute mark. I'm going to ask you, do you have any specific interventions or solutions that you would want to improve things?
To be honest, we have not faced any problems when we look at this, or I don't have any specific recommendations as such. So I think, as you said, don't fix what's not broken, right? So I think that's where we are. But I can't argue against the point that Vijay made that, look, CCI should have more resources at their disposal, so they're well equipped to face any future challenges. It's a fine line, I think, but the fundamental job is to protect consumer interests in the long run. And they should be well equipped to do that, and more resources will definitely help. But right now, I don't see any specific problem or recommendation that I have.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And I'd like to call upon Ramana Telidevpura, the founder and CEO of Code Tantra.
Thank you, Rohan. Thank you, CI and Professor Sridhar. In fact, I think I'm the odd one out here, or maybe you wanted this perspective from a smaller startup. Because all the ones who are there on the panel, remaining ones, they have already been through this journey, which we are about to start. So yeah, it's a very interesting topic, in fact, and very relevant for us. Being a small startup,
Hi, is it just me, or have we lost Ramana's audio?
Even I am not able to hear.
And I have lost the audio.
I think we've lost your audio. No, we still can't hear.
पीछे से किसी ने कर दिया होगा, ये तो WebEx है.
am I audible now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So I guess I should start from the beginning, right? Introducing myself. Hi, this is Aparna.
I think we lost you when you'd completed saying that, like, there are larger players out there and you're hoping to enter their leagues.
Right. So the topic is very interesting for us in the sense we are also in the tech space, of course, not as big as Upgrad and not into their segment of B2C. We are into a B2B market predominantly. And what we have seen is today, the way industry or the companies are growing, there is a key element of time. And time has a lot of dimensions in this sense. It's not just the technology or the product or the solution. If you look at traditional industry, you see the CD market, the online songs, online media market, how quickly it has taken out certain big companies, even like RPG Group, and So here we see the similar thing happening with respect to technology and the time playing a very key role. So being a small player in this market, I'm sure we see acquisition as a much more it's an advantageous thing from a strategic angle, and it's not just from the opportunity that we get to piggyback on a bigger organization which is acquired, who is the acquirer usually. We also get to see how we can enter new markets. Similarly, it's a win-win situation for both of us, in the sense they also look at acquiring a smaller company only because they see a strategic advantage in terms of the innovation, or as Falgun has rightly put it, they can only do so much. Or if they also want to scale up immediately, quickly in various regions or various segments, they don't need this kind of opportunity where they pick up the right people and right companies and source them. So I think it's a win-win opportunity and a significant thing. Only thing is how well, or if I have to bring out what Mr. Shardul has initially pointed out, the killer acquisitions where the smaller companies are actually acquired so that they are, in the very nascent state, they are removed from the, market, or for a strategic reason. So I think if that's the pain point, which has to be addressed by CCI, in the sense, how can it safeguard such interests of a small company where they are not, going into that phase of a killer acquisition. But otherwise, in most of the cases, I think it's a win-win opportunity. And for a smaller startup, it provides help from various dimensions. A acquirer usually need not be just a VC here. Here we are looking at a company which has gone through this phase of a younger startup and understands by giving what kind of help, or acquiring them, and by giving what kind of, that umbrella or the cover which is needed, they can potentially see that goal which the startup dreamt for, achieving it in a much shorter time span than what it would have taken on its own. I think it's a great opportunity for, smaller startups in this space with M&A to quickly reach where they want to reach. With respect to recommendations, I don't think I have any. Vijay has already covered many dimensions in that aspect with his experience. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just ask you a follow-up question? Is there
Sure,
anything, any changes that you feel could increase the number of M&As in India?
I think from if you are talking about a policy angle, I don't know if there is any policy that is restricting M&As as on today, because I see, it's just a match. It's like a matchmaking exercise where both of them see an advantage in each other, right? To either for the merger or for the acquisition. So I don't know. I can't comment on. I don't know of any such policy that's actually causing a hindrance there.
Yeah, and I think the answer may be, I think what many of us have hinted at, which is sometimes the absence of intervention is a spell. It's like the feature, and that's what causes. Thank you for
Why are
that.
you saying that there are visible reasons for M&A blockage? Yeah. Why are you saying that absence of there are explicit identified rules to stop M&A in India right now? Why are you saying that there are not? They are explicitly stated.
Vijay, you should have brought those up when you were proposing your solutions. Maybe at the end of it, I can come back to you after covering everyone else.
I would have answered that question, but I want to call out, there are explicitly stated blockages that have been placed in India for M&A. Explicitly.
Do you want to kind of say, like, if you're proposing it as a solution, can I ask you to reframe that as that? What regulation is it that you're saying should be done away with?
Every Indian startup in India has one or other Hong Kong, China shareholder. 100% of those companies are blocked to invest or acquire. I don't know how Zomato does it. Legally, they are not supposed to do it.
Got it. All right.
So all the startups in India cannot have an investment or acquisition to any target in India. That's it. No way.
Got it. All right. Thanks, Vijay. Thanks, Ramana. I'm going to call upon, I think it's Prashant Tandon, the co-founder and CEO of 1MG. Prashant, over to you.
Hi, my name is Prashant. I'm the co-founder and CEO of 1MG. Thank you, CCI, for having this conversation going. I think a very important topic. Most of the points have been actually reasonably well covered. I would just talk about, first of all, where does the organization fit? So we recently had a control deal from the Tata Group. So yes, we, as an acquiree, we have acquired and we continue to acquire a bunch of companies. And we also invest in multiple companies across the ecosystem. So, and I think personally have not had any challenges dealing with the CCI or the current M&A landscape. So most of the comments would be just as an observer of the ecosystem, but one or two things that do keep coming time and again. I think the first thing is like, I think on the lines of what Vijay mentioned, the digital economy and the startup world have very different characteristics that need to be taken into account, and the standard M&A yardstick of revenue based is certainly not sufficient. So the CCI as an organization, I think, has been very active, very positive for the ecosystem, and I think more can be done on the startup side by just building some of those nuances and capabilities around the startup ecosystem. One thing that specifically I have been observing in the ecosystem is that a lot of M&A happens just so that there is crowding of capital behind one entity and there is no more competition to come up. So as a general thing, that also needs to be seen, because these are all funded organizations, and how does it play? Obviously, none of these are easy questions to answer. Now,
Could I ask you to just explain that a little bit? Like, you know, when you say a lot of M&A happens because of crowding of capital behind one
so
entity.
I think I can just from our side of the industry, there were like 4 players for the longest time. Competition actually is good. However, all 4 were struggling to attract capital, and all investors were fairly clear. You guys merge into 1 or 2 entity and all capital comes behind, and then no one else will ever come in the game. And I think that is the general rule of the ecosystem, and that's obviously it makes sense for the investor, but I think from the CCI perspective, it's worth examining a little whether it's enabling the rest of the startups in that sector or it's disabling them when such kinds of things happen, given that the sectors require continued support and funding. So that's I would say a macro philosophical point. And now the other thing I think is, the other thing important is time is of essence in all kinds of M&A, especially when we are looking at the startup ecosystem. Again, as was previously also mentioned, I think startups just once they are already in exclusivity with an investor or a deal or with a strategic, it's important to make sure that the answer yes or no comes sooner rather than later, because otherwise that just is anyway end game for the company that is the target in that sense. Whether you are raising funds from a financial investor and waiting for approvals, or from a strategic and looking for an exit, because waiting 3 months, 6 months is not really an option on the table for such plays. So I think if we can make things the lens of a startup, which is speed is actually of more essence than a lot of other things typically. And otherwise, M&A is great for the ecosystem, because at the end of the day, startups, investors, everyone need liquidity. They need to have better exit options. And now we've got a bunch of those in the ecosystem. So I think in general, do we need intervention specifically? I don't think so. I think things are going fine. I just think building more muscle on the startup ecosystem and the fact that it needs to be looked at differently would be my 2 cents on it.
Thanks a bunch for that, Prashant, and for clarifying as well. I'm going to call upon Gautam Chopra, the co-founder and CEO of Beto. Gautam? Is Gautam there on the call? Gautam?
Rohin, Gautam couldn't join actually. So
Oh,
we
okay.
can.
Okay. I'm all right. No problem, Ms. Ghosh. I'll move to Mr. Sunil Mago, the president of the Chamber of Startups, Industries and Entrepreneurs Council. Mr. Mago, over to you.
Yeah, good afternoon, Rohin. You have been a wonderful moderator, and it's a privilege to be part of this elite group. And a lot of thanks to CCI for taking this initiative. Before I go to the mergers and acquisition, I just briefly introduce myself. I am Sunil Mago, basically a chartered accountant, but have been practicing law for the last 10 years. I qualified as a chartered accountant way back in 1984, and my forte is banking because I've got a doctorate in banking. And as far as this chamber for startup is concerned, this was established just to know about the problems which are being faced by the young startups and to take it to the requisite platform to solve those. And we have been lucky to some extent in the sense that 2 or 3 times we have been invited by the Minister of Finance, and we have given our suggestions, and some of them have been also incorporated in the budget. Now, to start with, I would just say that there are a few pillars of this ecosystem of startups. This VC and equity investors and angel investors, awareness creating agencies, legal and tax regime facilities and network. And what a startup is basically, it starts from the idea. So the young startups have got this problem that they do not want to share their idea because there is no protection. They fear some kind of piracy of their ideas. So a lot of things are required to be done. And as far as what the government is required to do is not only to fund, but also to create certain policies where those young startups are not vulnerable. So what is to be done? It revolves around alphabet F. One is friendly tax regime. Because what happens is this, most of the points have already been covered. It becomes very difficult and very easy for one of the last panelists to say, because most of the things are covered. So I am touching those things which are not covered. So friendly tax regime is required. And then favorable fundraising, which is always a big problem for the young startups. And the government has to have a fair and transparent policies. And then one more thing which comes to my mind is the formation of innovative idea bank. That is very important, which has been missing. And then comes the last point to my mind is financial discipline. As far as these mergers and acquisitions are concerned, 4 things which I'm going to touch upon is that there are 4 major challenges as far as the this merger and acquisition is concerned. See, one has to deal with various departments, various regulators, be it Income Tax Act or Companies Act or FEMA, and not to forget CCI. And then the second point which comes to me is the correct valuation. This is also a very pertinent issue because the seller will always only tell that you have not paid enough. He will never tell that you have overpaid. So correct valuation is very, very important. That is a major challenge as far as the mergers and acquisitions are concerned. Then there is a question of due diligence. We do the due diligence as we do in all cases, whether it is a matrimonial alliance or if we have to buy something. Similarly, in the startup, due diligence is of paramount importance. But I feel that sometimes the due diligence is not adequate in the sense that we sometimes take shortcuts and our approach is casual. So that is
Mago,
one
I'm
thing.
sorry to interrupt, but we are running late. Could I ask you?
I have not completed 4 minutes.
Yeah.
I'm just finishing with the last point and targeting the right company. Sometimes to acquire, we go to the wrong company. So we have to be very, very right in our approach, which is the right company, which fits into our mergers and acquisition, and which can do the value addition. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mr. Marco. And I think the last panelist I'd like to call upon is Chinnu Senthil Kumar, the managing partner at Xfinity Ventures.
Thanks, Rohin. Hope I get more than 4 minutes for being the last speaker. Thanks for thank CCI inviting. It's a great session. I have been listening and enjoying and noting down. And so I think I'll go with your order. My name is Chinnu Senthil Kumar. Actually, I'm a managing partner at Xfinity. Xfinity is basically focused on B2B technology companies, cross-border as well as domestic companies, actually. We cover multiple verticals, AI, retail, all deep tech, enterprise software. So I have a glimpse of what is happening. So where do we fit in? Like our companies get acquired, our companies acquire also. And so far they have not, but they are in the process of, you can say. And we are also an investor because many of our companies got investment from outside, maybe from SoftBank or GIC or Tiger Global like that. So basically I'm an interested party in all of them, but more of an observer. I think I'll kind of add to what previous speakers told. I think the way I look at it is the discussion about this CCI getting into tech landscape timing is perfect. Because if you look at US, Europe, everybody's scrambling to review the tech M&A guidelines. I think timing was great. And I think the other thing is, I would say the way we look at tech company itself has changed, especially in the post-pandemic actually. So, the tech-led transformations in health tech, fintech is completely altering, work from home, edtech, actually some of the speakers talked about edtech actually. So I think, not all M&As should be viewed in a negative light. And in fact, some of the things happened in the health tech is possible only because of tech transformation. And I think we should encourage opportunistic M&A. And the other point I'm going to talk a little more, I think Vijay briefly touched upon it actually. The other aspect we should also start looking at in the tech M&A is the global supply chain actually. I come from semiconductor background. In fact, I worked in Intel and SanDisk for about 15, 20 years. And that's the criteria we should start looking at it actually. If you look at India's semiconductor supply, it comes from outside. And there are a lot of likely disruptions because of geopolitical scenarios. So I think, probably that is an area also to add as a criteria actually. And then I think many of the speakers talked about, the criteria, how do you evaluate, what is the threshold to use it actually? Is it a market dominance, all those things? Yes, I think, not only in India, everywhere you need to look at the different metrics to assess. And I think in India's context, you need to define what is consumer hardships or harm actually, whenever M&A happens, or addressable market, because our addressable market is quite different than US markets actually. And I think the other thing is, rather than looking at individual M&A, probably they should look at a pattern. Recently, this new FTC commissioner, Lena Khan, she actually has, their team has taken a study and they looked at the M&A in the top 5 companies. They noticed a pattern, even though they have not passed the threshold, in terms of the company revenue and market cap and everything. But they see a pattern when you look at over a period of 10 years, how these big companies have been acquiring and harming the interest actually. So I think I would recommend, rather than looking at one company M&A, you should start looking at as a pattern actually. And I think, some of you talked about IP and data protection.
Can I just button here and ask you, when you say look at a pattern, do you mean patterns specific to one acquirer or patterns across a sector?
No, across the sector and also one acquirer, both. Because if you look at standalone, you may not be able to understand the pattern actually. That's what they have done actually. The Lena Khan's team, or maybe the team before, they looked at the acquisition pattern for 10 years. And they have found out by particular acquirers, especially the top 5, Microsoft, Google, all these companies, and then also in a particular vertical. So you should look at over a period of it to understand the predatory practice and everything, because they have a threshold, and obviously many of them escape the threshold and scrutiny actually. Okay. And I think, in addition to the global supply chain, I would also link the cyber security also. That's also another thing because there are a lot of cyber attacks happening in India, which are coming from offshore. We have a couple of companies from cyber security. We have investments. So we should start looking at from a global perspective. So the criteria has to be localized, but you have to look from a global perspective. And the other point, I think Vijay touched a point I also wrote down before. I think the CCI, the infrastructure may be sufficient right now. Going forward, it needs to really augment its capability. See, first thing I think Vijay suggested, you need to bring more experts. I think if I look at the current CCI team, the commissioners, they come from IAS, IRS, well experienced in different domains, very good experience, suited for conventional industry. But going forward, there should be some experts, either in the capacity of commissioners or a think tank, like from tech industry. That's something I would recommend. I do agree that 3 to 5 years, India is going to be a major tech M&A landscape. And I think we should start building infrastructure actually in the form of skill set actually. And that is one. The second thing is, I think we should also get out of this Delhi syndrome. I don't know why CCI does not have a branch office in Bangalore, because the tech is happening in either Bangalore, Hyderabad, Delhi. We should definitely have it in Delhi, but I think the action is happening a lot in in Bangalore. So they should have a branch office in Bangalore. Also, I think some of you suggested that we should study the global thing. Maybe they should have an office in Silicon Valley, and also they should have an office in like Europe, because there's a lot of competitive action being monitored. So they should have branch offices in these key locations, and that way they are well informed. I did read that they are closely collaborating with the US FTC and European Union equivalent of CCI, but I think probably they can have a branch office or field office in cities like Bangalore. I do agree with Vijay. I think they need to be equipping themselves for the days going to come actually. And the other topic, I think in the morning session, Sridhar highlighted, triple IT professor. See, if you look at telecom is over-regulated.
Mr. Senthil Kumar, you'll need to wind up in about 30 seconds.
Okay, fine,
I
no problem. I thought you were going to give me some excess time.
I had,
okay.
Yeah.
So whereas OTT is not regulated, so how do you synchronize this anomaly? So they should start looking at these things actually. These are the broad points. I have more, but I think in the interest of time, I'll just kind of,
Sorry, can you just repeat your last point, like, about OTTs not being regulated
if you look at
being an anomaly?
comes under TROI's purview, whereas OTT is self-regulated, the regulation is relatively linear, correct? So, if there are places where OTT companies are competing with telecom, it is not a level playing field actually. That's what I'm trying to say. So there should be a way to synchronize in adjacent areas, because there are new markets emerging which will compete with conventional industry. But how do you make sure that you give a level playing field for everyone actually?
Are you talking about who regulates telcos versus OTTs, or are you talking about how they're viewed in terms of their market operations and their industry, etc.?
Right. So the point is, see, if you look at telecom companies have been heavily regulated by TROI, right? Whereas OTT is regulated by a separate entity. In fact, the government has come with some regulation, and it's a very self-regulatory mechanism. But if you look at these two industries or business verticals, they are competing actually. But they don't have the same level playing field. That's what I'm trying to say.
I got that. There is a much wider ambit of regulation that, for instance, PRAI has, etc. Right? But are you comparing them in the context of competition law?
Competition, yes, in the context of competition. Because if you are kind of viewed different lens, then if you ask them to compete, that may not be the right play actually. That's what I'm trying to say.
Got it. All right. Thank you for that.
And I think I enjoyed all the points I heard. Very good ones actually. And again, I compliment CCI for folding this session at an appropriate time. Very proactive way of thinking actually.
Got it. Thank you. There's one panelist who has introduced themselves, and it's really me. I want to be the last one to introduce myself. I'm the co-founder of The Ken. The Ken is India's first subscriber-only business news platform. I think the CCI invited me to moderate today's session because I've been a business journalist for many years. But I'm also the CEO of a venture-funded startup, which is also what The Ken is. Thus, I'm hoping to moderate this interesting discussion as an interested party as well. Remember what I said earlier about nobody really being completely neutral. I think it's important that I disclose this. I think it's also important to disclose that out of the nearly 12.5 investors that we have at the Ken, one of them happens to be a panelist today, which is Vijay Shekhar Sharma, the CEO of Paytm. But in my defense, the selection of the panelists was entirely the prerogative of the CCI, and I had no role in that. But I think it's still important for the other panelists and the rest of the audience to know this. Thank you for that. I think we've run significantly beyond the time that I'd assumed we would for the initial sessions. So in the remaining time that we have of roughly 30 minutes, I'd like to convert this into a Q&A format. Before we get into that, I've made a note of, I think the important points that came up across multiple panelists. Multiple panelists agreed that there is a mismatch between the CII and its increasingly widening remit or the clout of the companies that it is dealing with, or the fact that competition is no longer restricted to a sector or to a country, etc. Therefore, I think multiple panelists pointed out that CCI needs to be given more powers, it needs to grow, it needs to have outside expertise, especially on tech. It needs to expand and have offices in Bangalore and possibly the Silicon Valley itself. This was point one. The other point which came across multiple panelists was that time, timelines, and certainty is a definite factor. I couldn't agree with that more. So therefore, there has to be a certainty when, like, someone said that, look, if there is a certainty to how soon and how predictable a manner CCI responds to applications, it will only encourage more companies to apply to CCI. And there have been many examples like where like companies have started exclusive talks, negotiations, and then it has broken down with the result that the company which was about to be acquired or invested in has often had to sell itself for peanuts or shut down, right? Because time is really of the essence. So the second point was timelines, and certainty. The third one that came up, at least 3 people brought that up, was control and competition. How do you define control and how is it linked to competition? I think there are enough examples. We no longer can assume that only a 51% stake impacts competition. In digital products, minority investments, strategic partnerships can cause market actions which impact competition. So how do you deal with that? An interesting point that came up, which I don't know how the CCI would deal with, if at all, is the issue of capital crowding a particular sector and lots of companies in it at first, and then after a particular amount of time causing forced roll-ups as that same capital dries up, and the message is, look, you better combine to 1 or 2 companies or else there's no more coming. What does that mean as that a particular sector coalesces around just 1 or 2 companies for competition, for consumers, for subsequent innovation? Does it deter once that coalition has happened? Does it prevent other newer startups from emerging in that field? There's also, I think, a point that was made about the definition of addressable markets and consumer harm. This is something that regulators all over the world are struggling with. Businesses are struggling with. I think one of the panelists said that it ought to be defined for India. So perhaps, the CCI could, I know it keeps defining these and redefining these, but how do these terms, consumer harm, addressable markets? I've seen many regulators, I think Ofcom, etc., that publish updated definitions for these terms, which take into account the changing nature of digital businesses. Maybe something like that for India as well. From my point of view, the last point that I'd like to add as a participant is what I think of as the elephant in the room, which is data. Most of our conversations till now have largely assumed that the construct that we're talking about is capital and market share, etc. And earlier on in the first half of this workshop, Mr. Nilekani had, I think, stressed upon the importance of data. And I think we should all pay attention to what he said. He talked about how the account aggregator format is going to lead to more portability of data across sectors. He talked about how ONDC is an attempt to end monopsony and will allow consumers to carry their data with them. He talked about how data portability and data empowerment are very important for competition and to bring down walled gardens. I bring that up in the context of how does data enter into the M&A landscape. I think up till now, we've all been assuming that when there is an M&A, it's how many subscribers or how many customers or how much revenue does this entity have and how does it merge and what is their market share. But I think increasingly it's worth asking ourselves that what happens to the data that was held by the acquiring, and does it automatically move to the acquirer? What say do consumers have? How do privacy laws, especially some of the new ones that we're all working on that are currently draft state, will impact that? I have a feeling that the next few years are going to see a lot of action on what happens to the data in an acquisition. That's the other point. These are, I think, the most significant points that came up. Before I start taking questions from the audience towards the panelists, may I ask if any of the panelists have questions for your other fellow panelists?
Isn't it an obligation to disclose related party transactions before the panel starts? Joke finished. I don't have a question.
Yeah, so I thought I should have, but then the introduction of the panelists was later on. So I didn't want to kind of from a narrative point of view, it didn't make sense. That's why I did.
I hope CCI pardons you for that.
All right. Do any of the panelists have a question for any of the other panelists? All right. It doesn't look like they have. So I've only gotten one question from the audience till now, and that question is directed at Vijay. Vijay, you highlighted that you use the example of the WhatsApp FB transaction, which you said was underestimated because regulators didn't see the impact of that. Frankly, I don't think anyone did, but that's with the benefit of hindsight. The question is, in your opinion, is it appropriate to not extend the de minimis exemption, which expires in March 2022? So, yeah.
I don't think in technology a lot should be done post facto. Retrospective has always been a bad hounding thing for India. So I would straightforward not do it, not change it. But I would be concerned about that there should be a lesson to learn. Personally, I am against anything changing retrospective.
But I'm inviting more questions from the audience. If there are, please, I don't know if there's some other place where questions are coming, because on my screen, I currently only see just one question. And since there aren't questions, I'm going to just ask
I have a question.
questions. Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah. I wanted to ask a question related to these approval requirements of investments timeline. And I think, like Prashant quoted, it is an important thing because CCI approvals are sort of one key driving factor of successful M&A. And death by delay is an important thing here. And in an uncertain environment, a lot can happen over 3 months. Although this is totally M&A related question, and I don't know whether this group has the people who can answer, but to you, Rohan, then, do you have an attention? And Prashant alluded to it, so that is why I'm also extending this. Is 3 months timeline 2 less 2 more? Or what should be the correct way to accelerate, and where is the depth of what is approval length required? because for a case which is extremely critical, 3 months can be less, and for a case that is extremely less critical, 3 months can be more, things like that. Any opinion?
Yeah, I will certainly say that I'm not qualified to answer that, but I suppose, like, the person best qualified to answer that first would be Mr. Shardul Shroff. I think he mentioned a significant number of, like, points around this about, like, the predictability about, like, doing things in a manner which is, like, known. So perhaps Mr. Shroff, you could answer that question from Vijay about what would be, yeah, please go ahead.
I think the process is such, as I explained in my opening, that today consents for combinations are given in a record time of, say, 17 days. So 17 days is not long by any stretch, but we have Form 2 also, which requires a very detailed investigation. There's a Form 1 and a Form 2. Form 2 investigation takes almost a year. Depending upon the complexity transaction and its effect on competition, if it's adverse effect on competition and is anti-consumer, favorable to consumers, then a more in-depth inquiry is looked at. So in terms of speed, I do believe that the CCI is conscious of the fact that in relation to startups, the time is of essence there and deal the transaction, that they do push the process very quickly. The whole problem again is that in the investor investor approach for CCI permissions, they look at it from the concept of control, and I think that perhaps is an incorrect view, because investor doesn't look at substantial control of the operations of the company. He looks at it from the perspective of negative control, where he is looking at minority protection clauses, and his director is only for a minority protection issue. He is not in the business of controlling the startup. He just wants to see that his investment is being properly applied. CCI is taking a view that no, appointment of a director is control, and I think that is counterintuitive, counterproductive. So that is something which I believe that all of you should represent to the CCI, that the principle should not be this. Principle should be that it doesn't change control. As I mentioned, the judgment of Justice Kotwal and the judgment of the Supreme Court will cover that issue. I hope, Vijay, I have answered you, or is there anything?
Thank you, sir. Definitely. Yeah. Well said. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Shroff. There's a question for Mr. Sunil Mago, which is, you talked about, like, startups are afraid to start because they're afraid somebody would steal their ideas. So the question is, what should be the mode of idea registration, patent or trade secret, or something else? What would happen if some idea is not executed at all? I think the question is from Deepak Maheshwari.
Whom do you want it to be answered by?
Yeah, Mr. Sunil Mago, I think he was the one who made the point about
mute. Rohin, he's on mute. Now he's out.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
can you hear me
I
now?
don't have the control. Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. What I feel is this, that Indians are the best minds in the world, and there's no proof required for that. But Indian companies are not the best. The main reason is this, that we have got a lot of ideas, and young people with lot of ideas, they, in the absence of proper funding and other related things, they feel some kind of protection so that their ideas are not get pirated. So I think there has to be a need for establishment of an idea data bank, where those ideas can be implemented by the bankers as well as the other equity shareholders, venture capitalists, and all others. So this is what I feel is the need of the hour.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Mago. There was a question.
Can I add?
Yes, please, Mr. Shroff.
Yeah, I think, as Dr. Agu has said, that the question of whether this is a trade secret or whether it's a patentable design, or is it a patent which can be taken out, something which must be explored so that there is no copycat syndrome, or there is the one who really has a unique idea can be protected by the in the operations, in their cash flow problems. People are affected in, they are more in the outlook for M&A. So the focus of the protection of the idea is something which is weak. And therefore, this is something on which probably as a association of startups, you should get, and there are clearly papers on how protection of intellectual property can be done. And this is, I would suggest that you should have a separate session, because it's important to protect your ideas after the trade secret.
Right.
Correct. I mean, as a journalist, I must say though that my understanding, and I don't know how it differs in India, is that in general, ideas are harder to protect its execution or processes that you can. But I suppose because there is also that line between be careful what you wish for. If everyone could go and register their ideas and then defend it, then you would essentially create a perverse incentive for people to just register ideas and hope to profit from them. But I think
Create a patent
it's a
troll
bigger
system.
discussion. Exactly. I think Gautam Chopra, the co-founder and CEO of Beto, who's one of the panelists, has managed to join back in. So Gautam, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. And I'm sorry, the slide, we had a slide, but I'll tell you what the slide was. It was, please introduce yourself, help us understand how your organization fits into India's M&A landscape. Are you an acquirer? Are you an investor? Are you an acquiree? Tell us how you see the current M&A landscape. Is it a problem? Is it an opportunity? And based on that, do you have any interventions that you suggest?
Thanks, Rohin, and apologies, everyone. Took me a little bit of time to log in. Just as a very quick introduction, I'm Gautam. I'm Gautam Chopra. I'm the co-founder of Beto, and what we're building is India's largest digital care ecosystem to help people prevent, manage, and control chronic conditions like diabetes. I think in the space that we are in, we feel because there is so much of synergy with the broader ecosystem. There is a lot of potential for M&A, especially when you start looking at what kind of services can be built using tech and roll out to in a cost-effective way to tackle this massively large problem in India. So this could be perhaps where a company like Beto could be an acquirer, and largely this could be around potentially new technologies in terms of monitoring or new services that are being launched where with an ecosystem that we have and the large number of population of people who are actively monitoring and managing their condition on the B2 ecosystem, we can actually provide an opportunity of distribution to some of these solutions. On the other hand, of course, there is a possibility of being acquired as well, because when you look at the broader ecosystem for us, whether these are pharma companies or insurance, there are specific use cases for players like us where we can actually get more significant distribution for ourselves, and on the other side we could actually be able to create more deeper value for these organizations which have already been present for a fairly long time in the industry. So I would look at it, both sides as potential opportunities for not only Beto, but chronic disease management platforms at large. And do we need interventions from regulators? I think, of course, when we look at regulatory framework, especially from the space that we're coming from, I think there's a lot of work that might still be needed. In terms of specific interventions, I don't necessarily see today that there are massively large players, that have come out presently from our area of work. But there's nothing specific that I would have at this point in time to seek as an intervention from the regulators.
Rohin,
Thank
can
you,
I
Gautam.
also
Yes, please.
give you interesting question had arisen on how soon a permission of the CCI should be received in a stressed asset company or a company which is undergoing the resolution process before the National Company Law Tribunal. And because of the inbuilt timelines under the IBC code, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs gave a letter direction to the CCI that these proposals must be completed no later than 45 days or no later than 30 days. I think since your industry is also so time bound in relation to its approvals, and any greater delay might just impact your proposal itself, you can canvass with the CCI and Ministry of Corporate Affairs for creating this kind of fast track disposal and therefore create a certain. This is a suggestion that I have for you.
No, thank you. We'll certainly have that and keep that in mind, sir.
I have this question from V. Sridhar. I'm going to ask him to clarify it a little bit more if possible. It says there are some clearer guidelines on horizontal M&A, but how do we deal with vertical alliances and acquisitions across services? Now, the reason I'm a little unclear about this, but I'm going to still pose this to the panelists, is that when you say how do we deal with, it's a fairly vague question, because I'm not sure what we are trying to optimize for. And I think all of us agree that by and by, you want most mergers and acquisitions to go through without intervention and not with intervention. But still, if there is a panelist who could answer this, how do we deal with vertical alliances and acquisitions across services? Please, do answer Sridhar's question. All right, Sridhar, if you could type a follow-up question, I'll try to answer that if you could frame it more sharply. In the meanwhile, I've got another question from Nandita Jain to all panelists. This is for startups and investee companies. Have you faced issues related to your investors investing in competing firms in the same sector? If this is the case, what has been the outcome? Any challenges? What is typically the allocation of control between investors and investee companies on the latter's management decisions? This question again relates to control, but I'm again unsure whether it's a regulatory question or whether it's largely a question between entrepreneurs and their investors, and other things. But if any of the investors, startups on the panel would like to answer that, please answer that. It would also help if you're getting questions which are addressed to a specific panelist, so that they'd know that they're up for a response.
So Rohan, I can at least jump in and share a little bit on this. I think it really depends on the entrepreneur and the investor and the type of investor mindset we are dealing with here. So for example, for us, for 1MG, Sequoia was one of the main investors, and it was one of the main investors in Practo as well. But they have been very disciplined and clear about it, and they'd offered to connect and collaborate if either me or Shashank or any of the teams would need. But that expectation setting was done upfront, and that has been adhered to. Now, having said that, that's not necessarily the norm, and there are certainly situations where I have anecdotally again, there have been cases where investors have forced companies to kind of come together by being the lead minority investor in two companies. So those kind of influence is there. It may be a control question. Having said that, I think it's much more about choosing the right investors and kind of being aware of their motivations, and people to people, there will always be a difference. So I don't know if there's a structural contractual way to stop that or enable that. So see, one solution blanket, this should not be allowed, I think would be counterproductive. It was totally fine in our case. And blanket that there is no such control situation. Another of those hard questions, but I do believe it's important to talk about these things so that people are more aware of control questions when entrepreneurs get into finalizing their investors and how they want to work with it. It's more on that dimension than the regulatory dimension in my mind. So just thought I'll.
Rohin, if I can just maybe quickly add, because we went through this exercise quite a bit in detail with especially one of the investors who recently came on board. And I think, as Prashant said, it was an outcome of the comfort that we could drive from this investor. We managed to at least draw up a list of, let's say, potentially direct competition who we did not want this particular investor to consider in the future. Of course, the market is evolving and certain other competitors could also move into a space which is difficult for a startup like us to also predict, and possibly for an investor. So instead of completely being able to block what they could do, we came up with a list of potential direct competition that exists today, and potentially the companies that we thought that could move into this area. And so accordingly, I would think we came to a relatively pragmatic solution, which didn't block them and also helped us a bit. But I don't know if there's a strict way to be able to enforce this.
Thank you, Gautam. I think Sridhar, who'd asked a question earlier, is unmuted. And Sridhar, if you could just just sharpen your question and ask it to a specific panelist.
So the discussion is that, when you have horizontal mergers, for example, in EdTech acquiring an EdTech, there are clear guidelines such as you may not exceed certain market share. For example, telecom, we have been having a lot of yardsticks, such as, for example, the spectrum cap should not be exceeded. The market share should not exceed. Annual revenue should not exceed. I mean, these are all, clear guidelines in the case of horizontal mergers. Whereas if you take a vertical merger, for example, tomorrow a pharmaceutical 1mg takes on Beto, for example, right? That's across the services, but it is vertical integration, and therefore the addressable market actually becomes very fuzzy, and therefore it will not be possible for us to use the same yardstick that we use in order to find out whether there is any harm to the consumer. In fact, consumer may benefit because of the economies of scope of different services putting under the same umbrella. So how do we deal with vertical mergers and acquisitions? FTC has also been struggling for quite some time. How do we deal with that in the startup space?
Would anyone like to take a shot at that?
I think it's a proxy answer I can give, but I don't know if that is because
Yes,
I'm
please
not
go ahead with it.
It's a very clear understanding that if, let's say, one large company goes into another vertical's commerce, let's say, instead of 1mg Tata is a horizontal acquiring vertical, if you notice. I mean, that is exactly where it is. And they themselves could have had large business, like one Carrot Lane got acquired by Tata when they have Tanishq and everything else and so on. Now, this is the core philosophy that we will offer customers more value and better costs, etc. But it is inevitably in long term you're killing a competition, no other doubt, because you have an incumbent business and you are acquiring a new emerging business. My opinion would be the same way that I said it a few minutes back, that industry vertical experts should be put on the panel like a jury in US, and they should have 1 week to meet an opinion and let the judge be CCI. Why don't we take that approach of experts to be called for that related acquisition and have the opinion on restrictions of things, etc., they could or could not do? You could allow with the condition that you would not for X number of years do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. My answer is more structural of a solution centric instead of an exact case scenario, because this scenario would apply not just vertical commerce, but also small vertical companies to horizontal, but horizontal, vertical, every case scenario it looks in it.
Got it. I'm going to ask a final question to all the panelists. I think we're almost at the end of this. I think we've all spoken about consumer harm or what is being harmed in the context. Mr. Shroff had talked about, like, some acquisitions are not about customers or revenue, it's about talent. We've talked about killer acquisitions, like, which are merely to put a company out of operation or to take its market share out of circulation, right? We've talked about roll-ups where the only purpose is to just ensure that one or two are left. Now, my question is that to all panelists is that none of these, for example, if, like, a significant acquisition happens where the market for talent, and if all of us, like, know that right now the most scarce resource for startups is talent. It's not so much capital, right? Or if it's putting a company, like, out of action by acquiring it. Are these even areas that you'd want a regulator to look at? Because, like I said earlier, be careful what you wish for. Once the regulator starts looking at these, then pretty much everything, every deal starts, like, appearing suspicious on some level or the other. This is my last question to all panelists. Is this something that a CCI should be looking at even?
Yeah. So from my perspective, as from a point of view of a smaller startup, I think any kind of regulation in or stricter rules that will hinder a seamless acquisition, right? Because as we already discussed, time is very essential, very critical in this aspect. And if you start putting in certain rules in terms of, okay, this can be done, this cannot be done. I understand where CCI has to kick in and, safeguard at the end of the day, the consumer's interests. But when it comes to startup acquisitions in this sort, I think there should be some kind of liberty, and that's what we today enjoy or have, and which facilitated what we see today in terms of very quick, small acquisitions that are happening or larger acquisitions or the mergers that are happening. And there's no way we can, as a country, go beyond the boundaries unless we have this openness or freedom. Probably we can learn from other countries where, if there are any such laws from this perspective.
Thank you for that, Ramana. I think that's the time that we were allotted. I thank everyone for your views and for being candid with your responses. And I hope we had a good discussion. The audience will know that best. Thank you once again to everyone at the CCI for enabling and facilitating this. It was really good. I hope we have more of this to debate out in public. Many of these things that in the past would always be talked about only, like, behind doors or inside files. Thank you once again, everyone.
Thank you, Rohin. Thanks to all. I think one picture is required, so everyone, all the participants at this session may just get their videos. Yes. So we are now always on screens. Thank you. So with this session, we end today's workshop, and I know these are long sessions, but thank you everyone for being so patient and participating and discussing the minutiae, because these minutiae are important to formulate understanding of a given activity. Thanks to the Commission for their continuous support for engaging with the stakeholder community to understand their perspective. And thanks to my team at the economics division, which and IIIT Bangalore. I've already thanked Sridhar is here. Thank you so much for collecting so many of the speakers whom we wouldn't have been able to get across to. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Roy.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.